The late afternoon sun poured golden light over the Miller Equestrian Center. 17-year-old Ella Wheeler pushed her wheelchair along the dirt path toward the paddock. Her hands, strong from years of independence, gripped the wheels with determination. Her legs might have failed her, but her spirit hadn't. At the far end of the paddock, he paced restlessly. Thunder, a towering black stallion, wild and furious. His coat glistened in the sun like polished obsidian, every muscle tense, every step filled with defiance. Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was a storm waiting to break loose, and no one dared get close. Not after 3 trainers left, battered and bruised, with whispers of, "He's untamable." But Ella wasn't afraid. She didn't see a dangerous beast. She saw something no one else did. Pain, hiding behind the fire in his eyes. Fear, camouflaged as fury. She understood it because she had lived it. "Ella, get away from that fence!" Her Uncle Richard's voice boomed, cutting through the air. But she stayed, her eyes locked with Thunder's. "He's not dangerous," she whispered, her voice trembling with a quiet conviction. "He's just waiting for someone to see him for who he really is." The Miller Equestrian Center, bathed in the warm hues of dusk, buzzed with the usual chatter of stable hands and the occasional neigh of horses. But Ella had only one focus: Thunder. From her wheelchair, she watched as the black stallion paced relentlessly in his paddock. He moved like a caged storm, his hooves kicking up clouds of dirt with each step. His ears were pinned back, his eyes blazing with mistrust. Every muscle in his massive frame screamed tension, defiance, and pain. Ella wheeled closer to the fence, ignoring the uneven path beneath her wheels. "Hey, beautiful," she whispered softly, her voice trembling slightly but carrying a warmth that even she couldn't explain. "I see you." Thunder stopped mid-step, his sharp ears twitching at her voice. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and the world seemed to still. The fiery defiance in his gaze softened just enough for Ella to see the truth. He wasn't dangerous. He was scared, just like she had been. "Ella, step back now." Richard's voice snapped her out of the trance. He hurried over, his face lined with concern. "He's not going to hurt me," Ella said, her voice steady yet soft. "He's just misunderstood." Richard let out an exasperated sigh. "Ella, this isn't a game. That horse could kill you." But Ella's eyes didn't leave Thunder. "He's just waiting for someone to trust him." As if responding to her words, Thunder let out a low snort, his ears flicking forward, curious. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't pacing. He was watching. Richard muttered under his breath, "You're as stubborn as your father." "Ella sonrió débilmente. And you're as protective as my mother." For both Ella and Thunder, this was just the beginning. That evening, Ella sat at the dinner table across from Richard, her guardian, her hands tightly gripping the wheels of her chair. The room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. "2 weeks," she said, breaking the silence, her voice firm yet imploring. "That's all I'm asking for. Let me work with Thunder." Richard looked up from his plate, his face a mixture of worry and disbelief. "Ella, do you understand what you're asking? That horse has injured 3 trainers. One of them could have been killed." "But they didn't understand him," Ella countered, her voice gaining strength. "I do," Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ella, it's not about understanding. It's about safety. Your safety. I promised your parents I'd protect you, and putting you anywhere near that stallion is the exact opposite of that." Ella's heart clenched at the mention of her parents, but she didn't waver. "You also promised them you'd let me live my life, not just exist in fear." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's eyes softened, but the lines of worry on his face deepened. "Ella, I can't lose you." "And you won't," she said, her voice trembling slightly but steady. "Uncle Richard, you taught me that fear doesn't keep us safe. It just stops us from living." Richard's eyes searched hers, seeing the same fierce determination he had seen in her father all those years ago. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You really think you can do this?" Ella nodded, tears glistening in her eyes but refusing to fall. "I have to try, not just for him, but for me." Richard sat silently for a long moment, his jaw tightening and loosening as he weighed the risks. Finally, he exhaled heavily. 2 weeks, he said firmly. But the moment I see any sign of danger, it's over. A radiant smile broke across Ella's face, the first in days. Deal. As Richard got up to clear the table, he glanced back at her. You're your father's daughter, all right? Ella susurró suavemente. Y yo lo haré orgulloso. The early morning sun peeked over the Pine Valley stables as Ella wheeled herself toward Thunder's paddock. Her heart raced with both excitement and trepidation. Richard followed close behind, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. Thunder stood at the far corner of the enclosure, his massive black frame glistening in the morning light. His ears pinned back as his hooves kicked up dirt, pacing with an energy that seemed too wild to be contained. He stopped briefly, turning his piercing gaze toward Ella and Richard, then let out a low, sharp snort. Are you sure about this? Richard asked, standing behind Ella like a sentry. His protective instincts were on full display. Ella didn't answer right away. She wheeled closer to the fence, careful not to move too suddenly. Her voice, steady but soft, finally broke the silence. Hey there, Thunder. It's just me. The stallion froze mid-step, his head snapping toward her. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ella felt his gaze penetrate her very soul, as if he were trying to decide whether she was a threat, or perhaps something else entirely. Richard tensed. Ella, don't... It's okay, she interrupted gently, holding up a hand to calm him. He's just curious. Thunder lowered his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he took a step closer. Ella didn't move, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She kept her voice steady, speaking as if to a nervous child. You don't need to be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you. The stallion's ears twitched, his muscles rippling under his sleek coat. For a fleeting moment, he seemed to relax, taking another cautious step forward. Ella sonrió suavemente, la esperanza floreciendo en su pecho. Richard's voice broke the spell. Ella, that's close enough. Thunder snorted loudly, rearing back slightly as the tension snapped like a rubber band. But he didn't bolt. Instead, he stood his ground, watching her with guarded curiosity. Ella turned to Richard, her voice firm. This isn't fear, it's trust, waiting to happen. The morning was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the occasional clinking of horseshoes in the distance. Ella sat just outside Thunder's paddock, a worn copy of Black Beauty resting in her lap. Her voice was soft yet steady as she read aloud, each word spoken with intention. It is good people who make good places, she recited, her eyes lifting occasionally to watch Thunder's reaction. The black stallion paced as usual, his ears flicking at her voice. His movements were slower today, less erratic. He stopped occasionally, his dark eyes locking onto her with a flicker of something new, curiosity. Richard leaned against the fence a few feet away, arms crossed. You really think reading to him is going to make a difference? Ella no se detuvo ni miró hacia arriba. It's not the words, Uncle Richard. It's the time, the consistency. He needs to know someone's here. For him. Thunder snorted, his nostrils flaring, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he took a cautious step closer. Ella's heart skipped a beat. She lowered the book, her voice soft but unwavering. Hey, Thunder, it's okay. You're safe here. The stallion froze, his ears swiveling forward. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed charged with something unspoken, a fragile understanding. Then, in a moment that felt like magic, Thunder took another step forward. His massive frame loomed closer as he lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air between them. Ella held her breath, her hands trembling slightly on her wheelchair. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Ella, don't move. I won't, she whispered back. Her eyes stayed locked on Thunder, her tone soothing. You're okay, Thunder. I'm not going anywhere. The stallion stretched his neck, his nose inches from her hand. And then it happened. His warm muzzle brushed her fingers. A ripple of awe swept through Ella, leaving her breathless. That's it, she murmured, her voice catching. I see you, Thunder. You're not alone. Thunder stood still, his wild eyes softening as the connection between them solidified. It was no longer about taming, it was about trust. Dark clouds gathered over Pine Valley as the afternoon turned ominous. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and the faint rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. Ella sat in her usual spot outside Thunder's paddock, her wheelchair firmly planted in the dirt. The black stallion was restless, his hooves stomping and tail flicking as he paced near the fence. "Maybe we should call it a day," Richard said, his voice uneasy as he glanced at the darkening sky. "He's on edge, and the weather's not looking good." Ella's gaze didn't waver from Thunder. "No, Uncle Richard. He needs to know I'm here, even when things aren't perfect." The first drops of rain fell, dotting her book with tiny dark spots. Thunder snorted loudly, his head tossing in agitation as the wind carried the scent of rain. His pacing grew more frantic, his muscles rippling under his sleek black coat. A crack of thunder split the air, and the stallion reared, letting out a terrified whinny. "Ella, that's enough!" Richard stepped forward, panic rising in his voice. "It's too dangerous." "No!" Ella's voice rang out with unexpected firmness, stopping him in his tracks. She closed her book and placed it gently on her lap, her focus entirely on Thunder. "Look at him. He's not angry. He's scared." Thunder trembled, his wild eyes darting toward her, seeking something amidst the chaos. Ella's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair tightly, and then softly she began to sing. It was an old lullaby her mother used to hum during storms. Her voice wavered at first but grew steadier with each word, carrying across the paddock with a calming rhythm. Thunder's ears swiveled toward her, his pacing slowing as he turned to face her fully. "That's it," Ella whispered, her song continuing. "You're okay. I'm right here." The rain poured harder, soaking her to the bone, but she didn't stop. Slowly, Thunder stepped closer, his trembling frame relaxing ever so slightly. And then, in a moment that made Richard gasp, the massive stallion stretched his neck over the fence and placed his muzzle gently in Ella's hand. Time seemed to freeze. Ella's free hand reached up, stroking his nose with the tenderness of someone cradling a fragile heart. "You're safe," she whispered through the rain, tears mixing with the droplets on her face. Thunder closed his eyes, his trust finally given. The rain had passed, leaving the air crisp and the ground wet, with puddles reflecting the gray skies. Thunder hadn't moved from the fence, his towering frame now calm, his trust in Ella cemented by the storm they'd weathered together. Ella, drenched but radiant, looked at Richard with unwavering determination. "It's time," she said, her voice firm yet soft. "Let me inside the paddock." Richard froze, his protective instincts kicking in. "Ella, are you out of your mind? He's only just calmed down. If something goes wrong—" Ella interrupted, her eyes locked on Thunder's. "Uncle Richard, look at him. He's waiting for me. This is our moment, and we may never get it again." Richard hesitated, his hand tightening on the fence post. But when he looked into Ella's eyes, he saw the same unshakable resolve that had brought her through so much already. With a deep breath, he nodded to Joe, who began opening the paddock gate. Ella wheeled herself forward, her every movement deliberate and slow. Thunder stood still, watching her intently, his ears twitching with curiosity. The air felt heavy, as if even the trees and wind were holding their breath. "Hi, handsome," Ella murmured as she came to a stop a few feet away from him. Her voice was calm, but her heart pounded in her chest. She reached into her lap and pulled out an apple, holding it out on her open palm. "This is for you." Thunder's nostrils flared as he stepped forward, his hooves splashing softly in the wet dirt. Every muscle in his massive frame moved with cautious precision. Richard and Joe stood on edge, ready to intervene at the slightest hint of danger. But there was none. Thunder stretched his neck, his lips brushing against Ella's hand as he took the apple. For a moment they were both still, connected by an unspoken understanding. Ella placed her free hand on his nose, stroking him gently. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're not just beautiful. You're brave." Thunder lowered his head, resting it lightly on Ella's lap. The sight brought tears to Richard's eyes and left everyone speechless. This wasn't just trust, it was a bond unbreakable. By the next morning, news of Ella's connection with Thunder had spread like wildfire across Pine Valley. The small-town whispers turned into chatter, and soon enough, curious townsfolk began gathering at the edges of Miller's Equestrian Center to catch a glimpse of the wild horse and the girl in the wheelchair. Ella arrived at the paddock before sunrise, her wheelchair moving over the dew-soaked grass. Richard trailed behind her, his face a mixture of pride and worry. The air was alive with anticipation, the town's eyes now firmly on Ella and Thunder. As she settled into her usual spot by the fence, Thunder approached without hesitation, his steps confident yet gentle. This time Ella didn't just bring her book. She carried something new, a custom-made harness and saddle, designed specifically for her. It was the final step in her plan to ride him at the upcoming showcase. "You're really going through with this?" Richard asked, his voice tight with emotion as he looked at the equipment in her lap. Ella sonrió, sus ojos nunca dejando Thunder's. "He's ready, and so am I." By now, even the skeptical Joe had come to trust Ella's instincts. He leaned on the paddock gate, arms crossed, a small grin tugging at his lips. "You've turned the impossible into possible, kid, but now the real work begins." The first task was introducing Thunder to the equipment. Ella held the saddle in her hands, letting him sniff it, explore it, and familiarize himself with the newness. He nudged it cautiously before stepping back, his dark eyes flicking toward Ella for reassurance. "You see," Ella dijo suavemente, "it's just something new, just like us." The crowd that had gathered behind the fences watched in silent amazement as Thunder began to accept the saddle. A young boy whispered to his mother, "She's like magic." By the end of the session, Thunder had allowed the saddle to be placed on his back, his trust in Ella evident in every calm step he took. Ella turned to Richard, her face glowing with determination. "We're ready," she said simply. The day had arrived. The paddock was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional sound of Thunder's hooves on the packed dirt. Ella sat by the ramp, her custom saddle secured to her lap, her hands steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. Richard, Joe, and a small crowd stood at a respectful distance, watching with bated breath. Ella turned to Thunder, who stood by the fence, his dark eyes locked onto hers. She had spent the last few days building up to this moment, and she could feel that he understood something significant was about to happen. "You ready, handsome?" she whispered. Thunder took a step closer, his ears swiveling forward. Richard approached her, his face etched with concern. "Ella, are you sure about this? We don't have to rush." Ella looked up at him, her expression calm and resolute. "It's not about rushing, it's about trust." "He's ready, Uncle Richard. I know it." With Joe's help, Thunder was guided to the ramp. The stallion stood still, his muscles taut but composed. Ella se arrastró hasta la plataforma, deteniéndose por un momento breve para tomar un profundo suspiro. Then, with careful movements, she began transferring from her wheelchair to Thunder's back. Thunder tensed, his nostrils flaring as he adjusted to the unfamiliar weight. Ella se inclinó hacia adelante, su voz suave y constante. "Easy, boy. It's just me." The air was thick with tension. Richard held his breath, his hand gripping the railing. Joe muttered under his breath, "Come on, Thunder. Don't let us down." Then it happened. Thunder took a tentative step forward, then another. His movements were cautious but deliberate. Ella sat tall in the saddle, her hands light on the reins, her voice calm as she guided him around the paddock. The crowd gasped, and then a ripple of applause broke out. Richard wiped a tear from his eye. "Would you look at that? She's doing it." Ella's face lit up with a radiant smile as Thunder carried her around the paddock. The wild stallion and the girl in the wheelchair had achieved something extraordinary together, a bond forged in trust and mutual respect. The evening air was thick with anticipation as the preparations for the showcase began. The paddock now served as Thunder's training ground, transformed into a space of quiet determination. Ella, perched on the mounting ramp, gently ran her hands over the custom saddle, while Richard adjusted the modified reins nearby. Thunder stood calmly beside the ramp, watching Ella as if he understood the gravity of the moment. His once restless and wild demeanor had been replaced with a quiet confidence, mirroring Ella's resolve. "All right, handsome," Ella said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "Tomorrow's the big day. Are you ready to show the world what we can do?" Richard handed her the reins, his face a mixture of pride and worry. Ella, I know you've worked hard for this, but the crowd tomorrow, the cameras, the noise, it might unsettle him. Ella met his gaze, her voice steady. He trusts me, Uncle Richard, and I trust him. That's all we need. As Richard stepped back, Ella guided Thunder around the paddock. They practiced the routine she had planned for the showcase. Simple commands, gentle turns, and transitions that emphasized their bond rather than technical perfection. Thunder responded to her voice with fluid grace, his movements synchronized with hers as if they were one. From the stable, Joe and Martha watched in awe. "It's like they've been doing this forever," Martha whispered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've never seen anything like it." Joe nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "That horse was untouchable a month ago. Now look at him. She's not just riding him, she's healing him." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the paddock in a golden glow, Ella brought Thunder to a stop and leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thunder nickered softly, his head turning to nuzzle her leg in return. Richard approached as Ella dismounted with Joe's help. "You know," he said quietly, his eyes glistening, "your parents would be so proud of you." Ella sonrió, sus propios ojos mojados. "I hope so. Tomorrow we're going to prove that nothing is impossible." The morning air was crisp, filled with the distant hum of chatter and the occasional whinny of horses. The Miller Equestrian Center was unrecognizable. Spectators filled the bleachers, and news vans with towering satellite dishes lined the parking lot. The energy was electric, buzzing with curiosity about the girl in the wheelchair and her untamable stallion. Ella sat in the stable, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened her gloves. Thunder stood nearby, his coat gleaming from the meticulous grooming Richard had overseen. The stallion seemed unfazed by the growing crowd, his calmness an anchor for Ella's nerves. Richard entered the stall, his expression a mix of pride and anxiety. "It's time, honey. Are you sure about this?" Ella looked up, her face serene despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I've never been more sure of anything, Uncle Richard. We're ready." The mounting process was seamless. Thunder stood perfectly still by the ramp as Ella transferred onto his back, the custom saddle and harness fitting like a second skin. Joe secured the final straps, his voice steady. "You've got this, Ella, and he's got you." As they emerged into the arena, a hush fell over the crowd. Thunder's powerful frame moved with a grace that defied his wild past. Ella sat tall and confident, her presence commanding attention. The announcer's voice echoed across the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ella Wheeler and Thunder." The crowd erupted into applause, but Thunder didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ella's, as if seeking reassurance. "I'm with you," she whispered, and with that, their routine began. They started with a walk, showcasing their unique communication. Ella's voice commands were gentle but firm, and Thunder responded with flawless precision. Each step, each turn was deliberate, as if they were performing a dance only they understood. The crowd watched in awe as they transitioned into a trot, their movements synchronized like poetry in motion. Ella's smile grew with each stride, her confidence radiating. For the first time, the world didn't see a girl in a wheelchair or a wild stallion. They saw a partnership, unshakable and pure. The morning of the showcase dawned with a golden glow that seemed to bless the day. By 8 a.m., the Miller Equestrian Center was bustling with energy. The parking lot overflowed with cars, and the bleachers surrounding the arena were packed with spectators. News vans lined the entrance, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky, ready to broadcast this once-in-a-lifetime event. Inside the stable, Ella sat quietly with Thunder. The black stallion stood tall beside her, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian. The growing crowd outside didn't seem to faze him. His eyes remained fixed on Ella, calm and steady. "You ready, boy?" Ella preguntó suavemente, pasando su mano sobre su barbilla. Thunder snorted, a puff of warm air brushing her cheek as if to say, "Always." Richard entered the stall, adjusting his tie nervously. "They're ready for you, Ella. Are you sure about this?" Ella turned to him, her face serene. "We're ready," she replied. "Right, Thunder?" As the stable doors opened, a hush fell over the crowd. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our special showcase presentation, Ella Wheeler and Thunder. Thunder's ears twitched at the sound, but his focus remained on Ella as she wheeled herself to the mounting ramp. The process, once daunting, now felt second nature. Richard and Joe stood by, but Ella didn't need much help anymore. With practiced ease, she transferred herself into the special saddle, securing the harness as the crowd held its collective breath. Thunder stood perfectly still, his muscles tense but controlled. Ella se inclinó hacia adelante, susurrando, "Lo tenemos." And then they stepped into the arena. The air was electric with anticipation. Camera flashes sparked like tiny fireworks, but Ella and Thunder moved as one. Their routine began simply, a demonstration of their unique communication. Thunder responded to her voice commands with fluid grace, his steps precise and deliberate. The crowd watched in rapt silence, every movement a testament to the bond between girl and horse. As they transitioned into a trot, the energy in the arena shifted. Thunder's powerful strides seemed to defy the limits that had once confined them both. The audience gasped and cheered, their applause echoing across the field. But it was the final moment that left everyone breathless. Ella guided Thunder to the center of the arena, her voice steady as she whispered, "Trust me, boy." She unfastened her safety harness and sat tall, her hands gripping the reins lightly. With a subtle cue, Thunder reared onto his hind legs, his front hooves slicing through the air like a statue come to life. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the eruption. Cheers, applause, and cries of awe filled the air as Ella and Thunder stood frozen in their pose, a living symbol of trust, courage, and unity. As Thunder lowered himself back to all fours, Ella leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. Tears streamed down her face, but her smile shone brighter than the sun. In that moment, they weren't just a girl and a horse. They were a miracle. As Thunder's hooves touched the ground, a wave of silence swept over the crowd, as if they were collectively processing the magic they had just witnessed. Then in unison, the arena erupted. The sound of applause and cheers was deafening, a roar that echoed through the valley and carried with it the awe of thousands. Ella sat tall on Thunder's back, her heart pounding like a drum. She looked around at the standing ovation, a sea of faces, many with tears streaming down their cheeks, their hands clapping with unrestrained admiration. It was the kind of applause that reached deeper than the sound. It was an acknowledgement of something far greater than performance. It was a celebration of courage, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a girl and her horse. Richard hurried toward the mounting ramp, his eyes glistening with pride and relief. He reached up to help Ella dismount, but she held up a hand, shaking her head with a smile. "Not yet," Ella said softly, leaning forward to hug Thunder's neck. The massive stallion stood perfectly still, his ears swiveling back to listen to her voice, as if he understood every word she whispered. "You were perfect, boy." "Thank you." Thunder turned his head slightly, nuzzling Ella's leg with a gentle touch that made the crowd gasp anew. It was as though the horse himself was responding to the love and admiration pouring from every corner of the arena. Sarah Mills, camera in hand, captured the moment with precision. The shot, a girl in a wheelchair embracing the horse no one believed could be tamed, would later grace the covers of magazines and become a symbol of resilience around the world. Finally, Ella dismounted with Richard's help, her wheelchair waiting nearby. The moment her feet touched the ramp, Thunder turned and followed her down, refusing to leave her side. The crowd's cheers swelled again as they saw the stallion's loyalty in action. "Look at him," Martha whispered to Joe from the sidelines, her voice thick with emotion. "He's protecting her." Joe nodded, his usually gruff demeanor softened by the scene. "No," he said quietly. "They're protecting each other." Ella wheeled herself toward the crowd, stopping to address them. Her voice, amplified by the microphone the announcer handed her, carried a quiet strength. "Thank you," she began, her words steady despite the lump in her throat. "Thunder and I are here today because of trust, because of love, because when the world said, 'You can't,' we decided to prove them wrong." The crowd erupted again, their applause echoing through the arena like a wave of support. Ella's gaze moved across the sea of faces, landing on Marcus, the young boy in the wheelchair she had met during her journey. His face was alight with awe and hope as he clapped furiously, his mother beside him, with tears streaming down her face. This moment, Ella continued, her voice breaking slightly, isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's ever been told they can't, about everyone who's ever felt broken or lost. You're not alone, and you're capable of more than you can imagine. Thunder nickered softly, as though in agreement, and the crowd laughed warmly through their tears. Richard approached her again, his hand on her shoulder. You did it, Ella, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Your parents would be so proud. Ella looked up at him, her own tears flowing freely. I know, she whispered, her voice filled with both joy and the weight of everything she had overcome. As the crowd began to disperse, Ella wheeled herself toward Thunder one last time, her hand brushing his nose. We did it, she said softly. Thunder leaned into her touch, his eyes closing in contentment. They had not only won the hearts of Pine Valley, but had also sparked a story that would inspire millions for years to come. The morning sun bathed Pine Valley in golden light as Ella wheeled herself across the familiar path to Thunder's paddock. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the changing seasons, and the quiet hum of the therapeutic riding center came to life around her. Laughter echoed from the arena, where a group of children worked with trained horses, their joy unmistakable. Thunder stood waiting by the fence, his ebony coat shimmering in the sunlight. He nickered softly as Ella approached, his ears swiveling toward her. Even now, after everything they'd been through, he always seemed to know when she was near. Good morning, handsome, Ella said, her voice warm with affection. She reached out to stroke his muzzle, the connection between them as strong as ever. Ready to meet some new friends today? Thunder nudged her shoulder gently, his way of saying he was always ready when she was. Nearby, Richard watched from the mounting ramp, his heart swelling with pride. The girl he had taken in so many years ago, the one who had lost so much, now stood as a beacon of hope for others. The therapeutic riding program had become a lifeline for so many, children, veterans, and adults alike, all finding strength and healing through the bond between horse and human. As Ella and Thunder moved toward the arena, Marcus, the 12-year-old boy who had been one of their first students, approached them. His face lit up with excitement as he guided his own horse beside Ella. Miss Ella, he called, can I show you the trick Thunder taught me? Ella sonrió ampliamente, asintiendo. Of course, Marcus. Show me what you got. With careful precision, Marcus guided his horse into a turn, using the techniques Ella had taught him. His confidence was unmistakable, and the pride on his face was infectious. When he was done, he beamed up at Ella. Did I do okay? You did amazing, Ella replied, her voice filled with genuine admiration. I think Thunder's proud of you, too. Marcus grinned, looking toward Thunder, who nickered softly in approval. The boy's mother, watching from the sidelines, wiped away tears as she saw the transformation in her son. As the lesson ended and the students began to disperse, Ella sat quietly with Thunder by her side. She looked out over the paddocks, the arena, and the people whose lives had been changed through their work. A sense of peace settled over her, deeper than anything she had ever felt. Richard approached, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. You've built something incredible here, Ella, he said softly. Your parents would be so proud. Ella turned to him, her smile radiant. We've built something incredible, Uncle Richard. None of this would have been possible without you. Thunder nudged her gently again, and Ella laughed. Okay, she said, stroking his nose. I'll give you credit, too. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the riding center, Ella looked at Thunder and whispered, We've only just begun, haven't we? Thunder seemed to nod in agreement, his deep brown eyes filled with trust and loyalty. Together, they had rewritten what was possible, not just for themselves, but for everyone who dared to believe in second chances. The camera pulled away, capturing the silhouette of Ella and Thunder against the warm glow of the setting sun. It was more than a picture, it was a promise, a legacy of courage, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a girl and her wild, untamable horse.